It all happened in November of '90. By then, I'd already seen my share of combat, from Afghanistan to missions in various corners of the globe. But nothing could have prepared me for what we were about to experience in Mexico. My squad and I were summoned for an urgent briefing. The moment we stepped into the room, I could feel the tension in the air. A table strewn with maps, chairs arranged in a semicircle, and a bright lamp hanging directly overhead all underscored the gravity of our mission. Our commanding officer, a burly man in a uniform that looked like it hadn't been taken off in days, sat amid a pile of documents, absorbed in his reading. When he finally looked up as we entered, he fixed us with a stern glare and gestured for us to take our seats. We sank into our hard chairs. Some fidgeted with their legs while others sat perfectly still, trying not to let their minds wander. The officer shifted the projector, turned it on, and soon a map of northern Mexico appeared on the wall. In a dry, matter-of-fact tone, he explained that, according to intelligence, a heavily fortified base belonging to a vicious drug cartel lay deep in the jungle near the U.S. border. This group had long been a thorn in the side of American authorities, not to mention a headache for the Mexican government. Officially, we had been given the green light to carry out an operation to completely clear the compound and take out the cartel leader. He then pointed to several spots on the map and clarified that our mission wasn't just about eliminating the ringleaders. It also involved gathering any documents that might help us trace the suppliers and manufacturers, sponsors, smuggling routes, logistics. Everything needed to be scrutinized. The cartel had essentially steamrolled over the surrounding villages through intimidation and a uniquely brutal cruelty. Anyone who didn't comply simply disappeared without a trace. With that, our commander warned us. No one was to let their guard down. The enemy was well armed and didn't hesitate to use any means necessary. We were told that the operation would be dangerous, and that casualties were a distinct possibility. Just in case, 2 bombers were on standby nearby, ready to provide aerial support. In addition to our 15-man squad, about 100 more fighters, split into several groups, would be involved. Our plan was to converge on the villa from different directions simultaneously, encircling it and neutralizing as many foes as possible in the first few minutes of the assault. Later that day, we boarded a large cargo plane. This model had been modified to carry both personnel and equipment. Crates of ammunition occupied the center of the fuselage, while metal benches lined the sides. The flight wasn't very long, but enduring the constant shaking and engine noise in a stifling windowless cabin was far from pleasant. By then, though, I was so used to it that it barely registered. After landing, we arrived at a military base near the border. We were greeted quickly and with no unnecessary formalities. The guards checked our documents before ordering us to proceed to the helicopters. The chopper ride took about an hour. As I gazed out the window, I saw an endless expanse of green, a vast carpet of jungle. I knew that as soon as we touched down, we'd be plunged into a hot, humid environment teeming with mosquitoes and toxic vegetation, where one misstep could prove fatal. The helicopters landed in a small clearing deep within the jungle. We quickly disembarked, 15 of us from the special unit, plus several other teams, and were swiftly assembled at a forward operating base. There, a command post was being set up with a couple of field tents, complete with communications gear and maps. Our commander outlined the plan, assigning directions and explaining how we would coordinate the assault on the villa. Once again, we were warned that bombers were on standby, and if things went south, the orders could be drastic, obliterating everything on site without any questions asked. An hour later, we piled into jeeps. The roads were nearly impassable, but our vehicles had tackled worse before. We moved slowly, careful not to make too much noise. The local paths were more like muddy tracks, pockmarked with puddles and tree roots. In several places, we had to detour around fallen logs or steep embankments. I kept a vigilant eye out for any signs of ambush or surveillance. By the time we reached our designated drop-off point, the pre-dawn fog had thickened. We had to leave the jeeps hidden. Beyond that point, stealth was paramount. We checked our weapons, silenced any potential noisemakers, and re-established contact with the other teams over the radio. Everyone was waiting for the signal to launch the simultaneous assault on the villa. But first we needed to secure positions as close as possible without being spotted by the cartel's lookouts. So, in utter silence, we crept deeper into the forest, fully aware that danger could be lurking behind every tree. The air was heavy with a damp, oppressive moisture, and there was an undefinable undercurrent. Whether it was the scent of impending peril or the jittery energy of our own thoughts, I couldn't tell. Even the seasoned veterans in our squad, who'd fought alongside me on previous missions, exchanged wary glances as if someone had sensed something amiss. Still, at the time, we chalked it all up to the nature of the operation. Yet with every step deeper into the jungle, I couldn't shake the feeling that this mission was going to be unlike any we'd ever undertaken before. Once we were well beyond the jeeps, we switched to a silent, foot-slogging mode. We were careful not to snap any branches or rustle leaves, and we stripped ourselves of anything that might give us away. I always told my men that in a jungle, especially a tropical one, the most dangerous enemy is the one you can neither see nor hear. We moved in a tight formation along overgrown bushes, clad in dark camouflage with our weapons at the ready. After a while, we stumbled upon a narrow path winding its way through the thick vegetation, as if it had been carved out by local hunters or even by the drug traffickers themselves. We decided to follow it, but only along the edge, keeping to the shadows behind the underbrush so we could vanish at a moment's notice if anyone else appeared. Mark, one of the most experienced guys in my squad, was leading the way when suddenly he raised his hand sharply, signaling us to stop and drop. We melted into the bushes, taking care to make no noise. I froze, feeling my heart rate spike. Moments later, voices and laughter drifted through the foliage. Someone was clearly approaching along the trail. Judging by their brusque tones and occasional curses in a mix of Spanish and local dialect, it was unmistakably members of the cartel. We tensed, peering through the gaps in the leaves. Soon enough, 3 men appeared, dressed in dirty pants and tank tops with their assault rifles slung over their shoulders. Their relaxed demeanor told us they hadn't been expecting any ambush. They were joking and laughing boisterously, not bothering to survey their surroundings. Another mistake that would cost them dearly. I signaled, and in one swift burst, we leaped from our hiding spots. The 2 closest didn't even have time to register what was happening. They were overpowered, their arms twisted and pinned to the ground. The third, reaching for his weapon, was felled with a sharp blow to the back of his head. It all happened in the blink of an eye, without a single shot fired or scream uttered. After quickly disarming them, we assessed the situation. They were dressed plainly, carrying only a few magazines, knives, and radios. Mark rifled through their pockets and found nothing but cigarettes, a little cash, and some scribbled notes. The order was clear: leave no traces, so we carried out a swift, silent execution. We then dragged their bodies deep into the undergrowth and camouflaged them carefully. I knew that if a patrol didn't check in at the expected time, the cartel might become suspicious, but for now, it was best not to draw any attention. Letting any of them live or giving them the chance to sound an alarm could have jeopardized the entire operation. Continuing along the trail, the silence was almost palpable, the only sound being the soft crunch of our footsteps on leaf and soil. Eventually, we came upon a small clearing overgrown with tall grass. In the center of this green oasis was a modest camp. Judging by the ramshackle tents and a sizable fire pit, it was clear that a small group of cartel members, about 5 by our estimate, had set up camp, as we could overhear snippets of their conversation from afar. We split up and encircled the clearing. In situations like this, we always carried suppressors. We had to neutralize the enemy quietly before they even knew what hit them. Targets were assigned: who would take out the sentry, who would handle the one by the fire, and who would cover the others. Within a minute, every man knew exactly who needed to go first. The volley was barely audible. A quick, controlled burst, and all 5 fell without a sound. We rushed over, checked for any signs of life, and dragged the bodies into the bushes, taking care to leave no trace. With the camp cleared, we pressed on. I had to admit that dispatching these foes was almost too easy, as if they hadn't expected anyone else to be in their midst. But a nagging, unsettling thought began to creep in. I started noticing an eerie silence around us. In a jungle like this, you'd expect to hear hundreds of sounds: the chirping of birds, the rustling of reptiles, the cries of wild animals. Instead, there was a disconcerting void. I tried to reassure myself by thinking that sometimes our presence scared away the local wildlife. Yet deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was at work. About 20 minutes later, Mark raised his hand again, this time beckoning me over to the trunk of a massive tree. Near its roots were strange markings. As I got closer, I saw that the bark had been defaced with symbols, smeared in fresh blood. They looked like twisted, runic lines, intertwined to form what almost seemed like eyes, tentacles, or claws. The sight was so unnerving that a chill ran down my spine, and the oppressive silence around us seemed to grow even heavier. As we continued, more of these bloody marks began to appear, on trees, rocks, fallen branches. In a low voice, I urged my men to be extra careful, warning them not to touch the symbols and not to linger in one spot for too long. Before long, we emerged at a small village hidden deep in the jungle. At first glance, it appeared to be a settlement of indigenous people living in a near-primitive state. Bamboo huts with thatched roofs, open fire pits, and simple everyday tools. But then we saw something far more horrifying. Bodies lay scattered everywhere, many shot, others bearing signs of vicious machete-like slashes. I inspected one of the nearest bodies. The man was dressed only in a makeshift loincloth, with no modern identifiers whatsoever. It was clear that this was a tribe with little to no contact with the outside world. With gritted teeth, we examined the area. The huts had been ransacked, turned upside down, and on the walls I noticed the same gruesome symbols, scratched and smeared in blood. It all added to the feeling that this wasn't merely a massacre, but some sort of ritualistic madness. In the center of the village stood a stone circle, clearly meant for ceremonies. Around it were small boulders carved with wolf faces. Nearby, a circle, inscribed within what looked like a pentagram or something similar, was drawn on the ground. The sight of it all made my heart sink. Some of the huts had been completely consumed by fire, reduced to ashes. The air reeked of smoke and blood. Not a single villager had survived. We couldn't fathom why the cartel would go to such savage lengths with this tribe. Perhaps they'd refused to submit. Or maybe the tribe was guarding something of value. That horrifying scene so soaked in pain and terror was the first sign that our mission was about to become much more than a routine cartel takedown. Still, the orders remained the same. Move forward, secure our positions, and prepare for a coordinated strike on the villa. We left the village with the uneasy feeling that we were stepping straight into the heart of a nightmarish ordeal. Our target was now in sight. Peering through gaps in the dense foliage, I spotted a tall stone building, a villa that looked strangely out of place amid the wild jungle. A concrete fence, guard towers, and floodlights all indicated that the cartel had seriously fortified the place. I couldn't shake the feeling that we might be under surveillance, but for now, we remained undetected. We settled into the thick vegetation and re-established radio contact with the other teams. It turned out that nearly every unit had taken up positions around the villa, waiting for the attack order, except for one group which was running late and hadn't checked in. We couldn't wait forever. The longer we lingered, the higher the risk our ambush would be discovered. Finally, the dispatcher announced that the operations leader had ordered the assault to begin, regardless of the stragglers. Immediately, tactical thoughts raced through my mind. Where were the enemy's weak spots? From which direction might reinforcements appear? And where should we station our snipers? We'd been assigned Sector A, which according to our intel had the fewest guards, though it could very well be a trap. As we received the final instructions, the first shots rang out from the other teams. The assault had begun. Without hesitation, we charged forward. In the very first moments chaos erupted in the villa's courtyard, the cartel clearly hadn't expected a coordinated, multi-pronged attack. Sniper fire, bursts from assault rifles, and screams merged into a deafening roar. I watched as fighters from a neighboring unit sprinted along the fence, ducking behind posts and trees. Meanwhile, we decided to slip around to a back entrance, bypassing the main gate entirely. One of the guards posted in a corner of the yard was moving too slowly. We took him out just as he was raising his rifle. I then pressed on, keeping the area ahead under constant surveillance. Suddenly, another thug burst from a nearby corridor and managed to fire a short burst at us. Bullets whizzed overhead. We dove to the ground and returned fire immediately. The attacker fell, and the smell of gunpowder hung thickly in the air. Room by room, we advanced through the villa. The relentless gunfire inside made my ears ring. I kept to the walls to minimize the risk of being caught in crossfire from the corridors. Bodies of cartel members littered the floors. Some of the wounded groaned in pain, but the orders were absolute. No enemy was to be left alive. These were dangerous men who could pull a weapon in an instant. Soon we burst into a spacious, richly decorated hall with marble floors, expensive paintings on the walls, and a decorative staircase leading to the second floor. Now, however, the hall had become a battleground. Stone columns pockmarked with bullet holes, shattered glass, and debris scattered everywhere. We took cover behind one of the columns when fresh gunfire erupted from the side. At that very moment, a bandit darted around a corner and fired a point-blank burst. We reacted just a split second too late. Mark, who had been slightly ahead of me, managed only to turn sideways before a bullet struck his shoulder. He crumpled to the ground, clutching the wound. Another teammate and I managed to neutralize the attacker before he could reload. We quickly dragged Mark into cover and examined his injury. His bone had been nicked, but he remained conscious, only gritting his teeth against the pain. We called in a medic, though we all knew from experience that we'd have to press on without expecting immediate help. We had to keep moving. The sound of gunfire throughout the villa hadn't subsided, and over the radio we heard that the enemy was still resisting on the second floor, where their boss was likely holed up. We ascended the staircase while laying down suppressive fire. Several flights led upward, and on each landing, men sat behind makeshift barricades armed with rifles and shotguns. We lobbed a couple of grenades, The explosions were so loud, my ears were ringing. Then we stormed a corridor and unleashed a torrent of gunfire. Attacking narrow hallways is always risky. We made our way past the bodies of the fallen, careful not to stop for too long. The enemy was cornered but still fought desperately. Within minutes, we broke through to the largest room on the second floor, where the cartel boss was surrounded by his lieutenants. The order was clear: eliminate everyone. We didn't waste time with moral qualms. A few well-placed shots and the boss fell before he could even reach for his weapon. Before long, the entire villa was under our control, though sporadic exchanges of gunfire continued in the more remote rooms. I radioed in that Sector A was cleared. After a quick head count, I learned that there weren't many critically injured in our unit, aside from Mark, who clearly needed medical attention. Then we received word that hostages had been found in one of the rooms, a group of women. We headed there immediately. It turned out these were local women, tribal by appearance, the very same ones the cartel had been keeping as slaves. They were gaunt and emaciated, many bearing the marks of brutal beatings. As we entered, they cowered in a corner. Once they realized we were not their captors, they began pleading for help. I noticed one woman among them who was visibly pregnant, her swollen belly an unmistakable sign that she was close to giving birth. There was something almost unhinged in her eyes, as if she'd witnessed horrors far beyond what we'd seen. It made me uneasy, but I quickly pushed the thought aside. We signaled with our hands that we meant no harm and were there to get them to safety. The women nodded nervously. I called over our medic, who quickly examined them. Apart from bruises, cuts, and the signs of prolonged abuse, nothing appeared to require immediate surgery. While the others searched the villa, I discovered a hefty stack of documents in one of the safes, neatly bundled in folders. It was clear these contained the names of suppliers, detailed drug trafficking routes, and financial schemes. The very intelligence we'd come for. In the basement, we also found a hidden cache of money. Entire boxes filled with cash. Then, over the radio, we received word that a large reinforcement force from the cartel, 300 or more men, was moving toward the villa. Apparently, someone had managed to raise the alarm before we could cut off communications. The order was unambiguous: evacuate the villa immediately. We gathered all the valuable intelligence and cash we could, secured the women. Those able to walk were escorted out while the more vulnerable were supported, and carried Mark out on makeshift stretchers. We made it into the courtyard, the distant echoes of an approaching enemy force growing louder. The sky over the jungle had darkened, and we knew we had to move as far and as deep into the jungle as possible to avoid being overwhelmed by a massed counterattack. We had plenty of experience in operations like this. The key was to stay organized and not panic. Yet that strange feeling which had first taken hold back at the village was now intensifying. We left the villa at a brisk pace, almost running, pushing the freed women ahead of us and covering those who couldn't move on their own. Over the radio, we were told that cartel reinforcements were already nearby. In the distance, the deep rumble of engines, trucks, motorcycles perhaps, grew louder. All told, our group, combined with several other squads who had also decided to pull back while keeping their best fighters intact, numbered about 85 men. We made our way through thick undergrowth, doing our best to throw off any tails. But it wasn't long before we heard the first shots and screams coming from behind us. I realized that our pursuers hadn't just been closing in, they'd already engaged a portion of our unit. Quickly relaying our coordinates over the radio, I soon heard the reassuring roar of approaching aircraft. The bombers had shifted into a combat course. We just had to adjust their fire so that we wouldn't get caught in it. Explosions rippled in the distance, with black columns of smoke and debris rising into the jungle sky. It seemed to force our pursuers to take cover and slow their advance just a bit. Yet we had one glaring weakness. The women, especially the pregnant one, moved slowly, and our group already included several wounded. We simply couldn't keep up that pace for long. After another kilometer or two, we came upon a small elevated area with a rocky clearing and a scattering of trees. It offered a good view and could be held under fire, so we decided to set up a defensive position there. There was hardly any time to get our position set. We split up quickly, some of us taking cover behind large boulders, others lying prone on the slope, pressed against the ground. The priority was to prevent the enemy, who far outnumbered us, from overrunning our position and opening fire. I assigned several of my men with machine guns to the best vantage points, covering roughly 180 degrees. In the center, we grouped the wounded and the women to protect them. Above us, the leaves rustled, and deep in the forest I could hear the rapid footsteps and muffled shouts of approaching enemies. I held my breath as I spotted the first shadows, dozens of figures creeping toward us through the brush. There was no time to wait. The moment they stepped into our kill zone, we opened fire. Automatic bursts shredded the foliage, and bullets splintered tree trunks. The cartel goons fell, but there were so many of them that they could easily attack from several directions at once. A real firefight broke out. Despite our advantageous position and tight coordination, the enemy's sheer numbers pressed in on us. Cries, short commands, and the whine of bullets filled the air. Our machine gunners did their best to cover our flanks, but in a few spots the enemy managed to get dangerously close, using hills and fallen trees for cover. We kept calling in airstrikes. The bombers made low passes that rained fire and shrapnel down on the jungle. Explosions erupted all around, their heavy rumble echoing through the area. We took casualties, no doubt about it, but our discipline and tactics helped us hold the line. I couldn't help but notice that the bombing runs were having a demoralizing effect on the cartel forces. After each pass, they seemed to hesitate, their attack faltering for a moment. We used those brief lulls to rebandage our wounded, patch up wounds with our field dressings, and check our ammo. In one such brief moment of quiet, my thoughts drifted back to that eerie silence earlier, the strange tribe, and the bloody markings we'd seen. A fleeting thought told me that aside from the cartel, something else lurked in these jungles, something watching us. I tried to shrug it off as nothing more than fatigue and stress, but even amid the chaos of battle, I couldn't shake the feeling that some unseen presence was scrutinizing our every move. I kept glancing around, straining to catch every rustle. It almost seemed as if the very ground was humming beneath us, adding to the growing sense of dread. In the short breaks between volleys, I thought I heard faint howling or strange, guttural growls. But as soon as the shooting resumed, the sounds were swallowed up by the storm of gunfire. Eventually, the enemy stopped their headlong charge. They'd likely realized that our makeshift fortifications were too strong, and with bombers still circling overhead, a direct assault would be suicidal. By dawn, we received word over the radio that our pursuers were slowly pulling back, probably regrouping. We remained at our post, exhausted yet still alive. When everything finally quieted, I felt an overwhelming fear. I'd been through plenty of battles, but this dread was different. It wasn't just fear of the enemy. I couldn't pinpoint what I was most afraid of, but deep down I sensed that the worst was yet to come. Some of my men were on edge too. A few clutched small talismans or crosses. There was an oppressive, almost cursed atmosphere about the place. But we were special forces, trained not to give in to emotions, but to follow orders. My job was to ensure the safety of my unit and the hostages, to get the wounded through the next 24 hours, and to extract everyone to our rendezvous point. Yet amid the brutality of the cartel and the inexplicable events of the night, a persistent unease gnawed at me. Something was clearly unfolding behind the scenes in this war on drugs. Something ancient and dangerous beyond our reckoning. I stole another glance at the freed women as we continued our retreat. Among them, I again noticed the pregnant woman whose expression suggested she'd lost touch with reality. Her eyes flitted anxiously from side to side and her lips moved in silent murmurs. I knew that with such a burden she'd slow us down even further, but we had no choice. We couldn't just abandon her in the cartel's lair. After regrouping, counting our men, and checking our supplies, the wounded were able to move, albeit slowly. We pressed deeper into the forest. With each passing minute, the sun sank lower and darkness crept in. Yet one thing was unmistakable. The jungle was eerily silent. There were no birds, no insects, no animal calls at all, as if every living creature had vanished. I'd seen this phenomenon before. When heavy fighting rages, nature sometimes seems to hold its breath. But this silence felt different, more foreboding, as if something had driven not only the wildlife away, but us as well. I tried to brush aside my superstitious thoughts, though I sensed that the others had noticed the unnatural quiet too. We moved slowly. Every so often the pregnant woman would stop and clutch her stomach in pain. Her companions did their best to comfort her, murmuring soothing words. Yet in their eyes I saw not only worry, but a kind of religious reverence, as if they harbored a secret. I decided that we'd take short breaks without ever letting our guard down. After a couple of hours wandering, we finally emerged at the very same village where we'd witnessed that gruesome massacre. The moment the women recognized their home, they broke down in tears. Suddenly, the deranged pregnant woman shrieked and, breaking formation, bolted toward the bodies scattered among the ruins of the huts. She cradled the blood-stained remains, clearly those of her kin, and wept with such piercing intensity that a chill ran down my spine. I felt frozen, unsure of how to ease her grief. We had no choice but to set up camp in that death-haunted village. Even if the very air reeked of despair, we needed to rest, to check our ammunition, and to let everyone recover. I ordered my men to take up positions along the perimeter, assigning guards and designating the least damaged huts for temporary shelter. The sky had turned overcast by now, and a tropical downpour was likely to hit by evening. There was no word of an imminent attack, but our scouts reported that several cartel squads were nearby, apparently planning something. And radio chatter suggested they were intent on surrounding the area. We couldn't risk a head-on confrontation with superior numbers, especially with hostages and wounded in tow. So we settled in to defend, hoping that under cover of night we might slip away. Some of the soldiers, upon seeing the mutilated bodies of the villagers, decided to give them a proper burial, a final act of respect, so that their souls might rest in peace. The women agreed, gathering the bodies and helping to dig shallow graves. The atmosphere in the village grew even gloomier. The sound of shovels striking the earth mingled with quiet sobbing. I even found myself helping to carry a corpse, realizing that this small act might ease the tension for all of us. When night finally fell, we huddled around several campfires, doing our best to ration our food and water. The women ate in near silence. I noticed that the pregnant woman had stopped screaming, yet her face remained etched with sorrow and an odd, fanatical intensity. Beside her, 2 other women occasionally hummed softly in their native tongue, their low, chant-like laments adding to the oppressive gloom. What struck me most, though, was the uncanny silence around us. The crackling of the fire did little to break the eerie stillness. No wind rustled, no rain fell, even though heavy clouds loomed overhead. I checked with our sentries several times, asking if they'd seen any movement in the forest. Every time the answer was the same: nothing. But then, about half an hour before midnight, one of the men reported hearing strange noises, as if someone were slowly circling the village. We switched on our thermal scopes, but they picked up nothing, no human heat signatures. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I hadn't experienced anything like this even in the heat of battle. Perhaps the enemy was moving far beyond our line of sight, but those rustlings, that hidden presence, it didn't resemble ordinary human movement. Besides, any human figure would have lit up on our scopes. Before long, other soldiers confirmed that they too heard scraping sounds and rustling as if claws were scraping along the bark of trees. In that deep, oppressive silence, every sound became a harbinger of dread. Some of the more superstitious guys pulled out small crosses and others whispered quiet prayers. The night seemed endless. Exhaustion weighed on us, yet sleep was impossible. Every minute we feared another burst of gunfire or the sudden attack of some unseen beast from the darkness. At one point I tried to catch a few moments of rest leaning against my pack. But the moment I closed my eyes, vivid images flooded back. Bloody symbols scrawled on trees, the dead, contorted faces of villagers, and the mad look in the pregnant woman's eyes. My heart pounded as if I were back in the middle of a firefight. That's how we managed to hold out until dawn. No one stormed the village, and we didn't see any human movement outside. Yet the sense of dread lingered, punctuated by intermittent noises that reminded us that in this dark jungle, events were unfolding beyond our understanding. As the first light of day crept in, we utterly spent, decided it was time to move on. Staying any longer would only increase the risk of running into the cartel, or something even more terrifying. Even in the weak light of dawn, I couldn't shake the feeling that the night had been only the beginning of an endless horror that would continue to haunt us in this cursed forest. The next morning, we resolved to leave the village as quickly as possible. In the pale light of dawn, the grim images of the night slowly receded, though the trees still stood as silent witnesses to the recent tragedy, and the ghostly quiet of the forest promised nothing good. We gathered the wounded, the remaining supplies, and set off again, hoping to gain even a little time on our pursuers. Our column stretched out. At the front marched our most combat-ready fighters. In the middle were the women and those who could support them, and at the rear, a few extra soldiers provided cover. The pregnant woman, whom I'd noticed several times before, still looked as if she were teetering on the brink of madness. Her eyes darted wildly, and she often clutched her stomach as if in unbearable pain. Flanking her were 2 other women from the same tribe, murmuring softly as if to encourage her, or perhaps even perform a ritual. I did my best to push those thoughts aside. The situation was tense enough as it was. We advanced only a couple of miles when, in the distance, gunfire erupted once more. It was clear that our trail had been discovered and the enemy was tightening the noose. We needed to find a defensible position, like the one we'd set up the previous night. Unfortunately, amid the thick brush, it was hard to find a good spot, so we had to improvise, either hunkering down behind boulders or taking cover on a small hill. The sound of gunfire grew louder by the second. Scanning our surroundings, I noticed a gently sloping rise to our right, dotted with rocky outcrops. At the top, a few scattered trees offered potential cover with their sturdy trunks. We made a dash for it, moving in a tight chain through the undergrowth while keeping an eye out for the best spots to station our men and protect the women. But before we could get into position, the pregnant woman suddenly stopped and let out a scream so piercing it nearly made my ears ring. For a split second, her cry resembled the wail of a cornered animal. She clutched her stomach and collapsed to her knees, her face contorted in agony. Several soldiers rushed over to help, but I gestured urgently for her to keep quiet. Any noise like that could give us away. Unfortunately, she was lost in her own torment. At that very moment, I heard short bursts of gunfire from below where our rear guard was holding the line. The enemy had indeed come dangerously close. The firefight reignited. Bullets whistled overhead, snapping branches as they tore through the air. Some of us dropped to the ground and returned fire, while others scrambled to deal with the anguished woman writhing in pain. Her cries grew louder. Even amid explosions and the staccato rhythm of gunfire, her screams dominated the soundscape. I bent down, determined to calm her, but as I approached, a sharp scent of blood hit me, and I saw her stomach trembling in an unnatural, violent way, as if something far more powerful than a normal baby was struggling within. For a terrifying moment, I thought I saw the faint outline of long, slender fingers pressing from inside. I stood about a meter away with 4 of my men circling her, all of us unsure of what to do next. One of the captive women nearby began murmuring and swaying, her words lost in the melee. All of this unfolded against the backdrop of the chaos around us. Automatic fire, explosions, shouts. Every instinct screamed at me to back away. Then, without warning, the pregnant woman suddenly straightened, arching her back, and let out a guttural, almost primal roar. I watched in horror as the skin on her stomach tightened and then tore apart. Blood and a viscous, unholy fluid erupted from the gash. The sight nearly made me vomit. From her womb, something began to emerge. A creature that bore no resemblance to a human infant. It looked like a twisted hybrid between man and wolf. Slick, moist skin patched with clumps of coarse hair, long clawed limbs, and a face that was neither entirely beast nor completely human. The creature reeked of decay and foul breath. A soldier in our unit, Jake, I believe, raised his rifle as if ready to fire, glancing at me for silent permission. In that split second, I was paralyzed with indecision. For a moment, the creature lingered beside the mutilated, lifeless body of the woman, as if shocked by its own emergence. The pregnant woman lay still, her eyes empty, surrounded by a spreading pool of warm blood. Then, staggering as if in shock, the creature rose onto 2 legs, lifted its blood-smeared paws, and let out a strange, hoarse hiss that quickly gave way to a roar. More animal than human. Before anyone could react further, the creature lunged sideways, using all 4 limbs to propel itself, and vanished into the dense undergrowth. We all froze, stunned into silence by what we had just witnessed. Even in the midst of battle, scenes like that have a way of shaking you to your very core. We stood there, stunned, not knowing what to do next. The fighting raged all around us. Gunfire burst from one side while explosions thundered nearby. It seemed the cartel had no plans to retreat, or perhaps they simply no longer had any commanders to order a withdrawal. We, still reeling from shock, stared at the body of the pregnant woman, from whose womb that monstrous creature had erupted only minutes earlier. Her eyes remained open, her face frozen in an unnatural grimace of pain and terror. No matter how much we wanted to help her, we felt utterly powerless. overwhelmed by a sense of helplessness and disbelief. The other women, her tribal companions by the look of it, continued their prayers. They knelt in the tropical mud, closed their eyes, and swayed back and forth as they chanted in near silence. Although we couldn't understand the words of their supplications, their voices were strained, as if they struggled to hold back a cry or scream that threatened to burst forth. Our training in psychological warfare had taught us that shock can sometimes induce a trance-like state, but this was more than that. It was a ritual they refused to break. Meanwhile, the bursts of gunfire and the clamor of close combat ebbed and flowed. I forced myself to regain composure and ordered my men to secure the perimeter. My command came out in hushed tones. My voice lagged as the horrifying scene we had just witnessed had frozen my thoughts. Yet our special forces training kicked in. Men quickly took up positions behind trees and boulders, scanning every approach. The wounded were sheltered a little further back, with others busy tending to their injuries. Then, heart-wrenching screams began to echo from deep within the forest. At first, these sounds were distant and almost lost amid the gunfire, but soon they became clear, cutting through the intermittent lulls when the shooting subsided. The screams seemed to emanate from where, by our estimates, the cartel's main forces were stationed. There was something especially eerie about those cries, nothing like the usual moans of the wounded. It was as if people were screaming their last moments in agony and terror. The screams alternated from the right and left, as if the horror was unfolding simultaneously in several places. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the gunfire ceased. A pause as if the battle had been cut off mid-sentence. An oppressive, clammy silence fell, broken only by the heavy, ragged breathing of the injured. I signaled for my men to hold position and wait. No one dared move. Too many threats lurked around. We feared the enemy was lying in ambush. Yet minutes passed without any new attacks. Our scout, Marco, volunteered to move forward and investigate the source of the screams. His ability to move silently and blend into the foliage was invaluable. He set off along a narrow trail that led toward the cries, and we remained behind, holding our breath. After about 15 minutes, the radio crackled. Marco whispered that I should come meet him personally and see what was happening. His voice carried a strange mix of fear and detachment. I knew he had witnessed something terrible. Leaving the order to hold the perimeter and cover the wounded, I checked my weapon and ventured into the dense undergrowth to join him. I moved cautiously through the tangle of branches and scattered debris, spent shells and broken twigs left over from earlier firefights, skirting around bodies to avoid drawing attention. The air reeked of gunpowder, decay, and a sickly sweet rot that hinted at something even more ominous. Every so often I encountered the bodies of cartel members killed in previous skirmishes. Some bore the unmistakable marks of bullet wounds, while others showed horrendous, ragged lacerations that could not have been inflicted by any conventional weapon. At last I saw Marco a few steps ahead. He stood with his back to me, unmoving, as if petrified. Upon hearing my approach, he slowly turned his head and motioned for me to look down at the ground. As I drew near, a sickening feeling gripped me. Lying before us was the body of a cartel thug. His chest had been torn open as if ripped apart by gigantic claws. His innards spilled out and his face was contorted in a final agonizing grimace. Blood had soaked the ground and torn pieces of clothing and flesh lay scattered about. I examined the wounds carefully. They were clearly not from a bullet or a knife. I remembered the creature that had burst forth from the pregnant woman, its lupine fangs and vicious claws, and everything began to form a monstrous picture. That beast had attacked a segment of the cartel forces and dismembered them in minutes. This, I realized, explained those terrifying screams. Yet I couldn't afford to let fear paralyze me. I still had my wounded men and the remainder of my unit counting on me. I quietly told Marco that this was our chance. Since the creature had distracted the cartel, perhaps we now had time to slip deeper into the jungle and reach our evacuation point. We could not hope to engage such a force head-on, and with our ammunition rapidly depleting, we had no other option. Marco nodded silently. His pallor told me he understood the grim necessity. Returning to our group, I announced that we needed to retreat immediately. The wounded were helped to stand by those strong enough, and a couple of soldiers fashioned makeshift stretchers from branches and straps to carry the gravely injured. But then a new problem arose. The surviving women still clung to the body of the fallen pregnant woman. They sat there, eyes half mad, shaking their heads as if unwilling to leave. They continued their quiet, haunting chant, refusing to move. I tried to make them understand that staying was too dangerous, that at any moment, either another wave of cartel attackers or that monstrous creature might appear. But they seemed oblivious, lost in their own world of prayer or incantation, as if continuing the ritual we'd witnessed earlier in the village. My men exchanged uneasy glances. A few muttered that we didn't have time to forcibly drag these women along. I contacted the dispatcher and briefed them on the situation. We had wounded soldiers. Our ammunition was nearly exhausted. A bloodthirsty creature roamed the forest, and the women refused to evacuate. The response was curt. Our priority was our own survival and that of the wounded. Command ordered us to move on and leave behind anyone unwilling to come. Inside, I felt as though something had shattered. I was forced to abandon them. But looking at my injured men and recognizing the risk to the entire unit, I had no choice. I gave the order, and we began to withdraw deeper into the jungle, taking along everyone who could move. The last thing I saw as I glanced back was the haunting silhouettes of the women, seated in a circle over the fallen body, swaying and chanting a farewell that was as terrifying as it was mesmerizing, as if bidding us into another world. We melted into the undergrowth, following a barely visible trail that wound deeper into the jungle, always cautious to avoid the main routes used by the traffickers. I led the column, halting occasionally to check every meter ahead. I couldn't risk falling into another ambush or encountering some unknown beast. Hour after hour, we struggled through the dense green thicket. Sweat streamed down our faces, and every step became a battle as exhaustion set in. Our wounded men barely managed to keep pace, but the support of their comrades and sheer stubbornness kept them moving. We all knew that reaching our designated evacuation point was essential. If we didn't, we were all doomed. Suddenly, a disheveled man with an assault rifle appeared directly in our path. We instantly raised our weapons, ready to open fire. But he didn't shoot. Instead, he looked lost and terrified beyond measure. When we disarmed him and pinned him to the ground, he offered no resistance. He resembled a classic cartel thug, with visible tattoos, a bullet belt, and small packets of cocaine in his pocket. I ordered him taken aside for a quick interrogation. To my surprise, the man was unusually talkative. His fear of what he had witnessed outweighed his fear of us. Through halting, breathless explanations, we learned that his gang had attacked the village, killing everyone they deemed worthless, and had taken the women for the pleasure of their leaders. He mentioned that earlier they had noticed the locals performing strange rituals involving wolf idols and grim symbols, though none of his comrades had paid it any mind. He went on to say that after the massacre, wild howling began in the forest, and all the animals seemed to vanish. His partners had joked that crazy Indians had cursed the land, but their boss dismissed such mysticism. Yet that day, according to him, a demon, he called it hombre lobo, meaning werewolf, had descended upon their squads. I listened, realizing that everything was falling into place. The pregnant woman, the bloody symbols, the ritual, and the birth of that creature. We didn't waste any time with the prisoner. We lacked the resources to transport him. I ordered his hands bound and left him by the slope, explaining that if someone found him, so be it. If not, that was his fate. He said nothing more, muttering only that he was doomed anyway because the wolf or the devil was nearby. Then we pressed on, desperately trying to buy time before nightfall. In the tropics, darkness comes quickly, and after the horrors of the previous night, I was desperate not to be caught in that impenetrable blackness again, knowing that something monstrous might be stalking us. But our strength was failing, and the day was nearly over. The sucking mud and tangled roots slowed our progress. As dusk fell, the forest again grew silent. I noticed some of my men exchanging furtive glances and whispers, an ominous sign. For fear is one of the most ruthless enemies of special forces, even more relentless than the bandits themselves. Eventually we came upon a small stream and realized that from here we'd have to either follow its bank or attempt a crossing to the opposite side. At last, the commander of another squad, we maintained short-range radio contact, suggested that we stop on a higher bank. There was a natural embankment with dry soil, a place that would serve well as a camp. We agreed as exhaustion was setting in and risking movement in the dark would be suicide. I gave the order to set up camp. Several men immediately established defensive positions, rigging tripwires and signal grenades at the approaches to prevent any stealthy intrusions. Others set the wounded in place, laid out bedding, and arranged a small fire for warmth and to boil water. The twilight deepened. The sky turned from gray to nearly black. Night fell, and the forest was once again cloaked in an icy silence. We spoke little. Only necessary radio communications and quiet commands. Deep in the camp, some tried to doze off, but few managed true sleep. I sat under a tree, acutely aware of how fatigue twisted my joints. Yet fear kept my adrenaline surging, denying me rest. After a while, I heard a branch snap to the right of our camp. Every soldier tensed and gripped their weapon. In our night scopes and thermal imagers, nothing distinct appeared. Everything was clear. We surmised it could have been a wild animal or perhaps someone from the cartel trying to get close. A few soldiers readied stun grenades when suddenly another snap came from the opposite side. We stood ready as noises shifted around the camp, constantly changing direction. At times I heard creaks and low growls. Not distinctly a wolf's howl, but a distorted sound as if something larger, something unfamiliar were breathing. Some of my men's nerves finally buckled. One began to mutter prayers while another trembled as if stricken by fever. I gripped my rifle so tightly my fingers went numb. Finally, one soldier positioned at the perimeter fired a few shots in an attempt to ward off the unknown intruder. But as soon as he fired, a shadow flitted on our left, a quick movement, and muffled groans erupted. I rushed over to see what had happened. As I approached, I discovered two of my men lying on the ground. One appeared already dead, blood spurting from his chest, while the other writhed in pain, wounded in the thigh and side. We hurriedly dragged the injured deeper into the camp. The others opened a barrage of gunfire at a moving silhouette that darted between the trees. Bullets tore through leaves and snapped branches, but the creature, whatever it was, moved with a speed and agility that defied our shots. Several times I caught on the thermal scope the outline of a large body, much larger than a human with a wolf-like head. It leapt from one hiding spot to another, approaching our camp only to vanish again. How it had grown so much in size flashed through my mind, and I was truly terrified. We decided to form a circular defense, but the creature seemed to anticipate our moves. A harrowing confrontation ensued. Each of us clutched our weapon, focusing on our assigned sectors. Then the creature leapt over one of our tripwires, its bulk slamming into it with a thud. An explosion rang out, and I heard a roar filled with rage and agony. It meant we had indeed injured it. But rather than retreat, it charged our camp with renewed fury. At one point I caught a glimpse of it in my sights, a brief flash, and I realized it wasn't merely an animal, but a hybrid. Enormous paws with elongated claws, a body reminiscent of an emaciated human, and a head that was wolf-like, with terrifying bottomless eyes. Its snout was smeared with blood. I managed to squeeze off a few shots, though I wasn't sure if I hit my mark. All the while, my hands trembled and cold sweat beaded on my forehead. The creature leapt onto one of my men, knocking him down. I heard the sickening crunch of bones and a final, agonized cry. Then someone lobbed a grenade, but before it exploded, I saw the beast recoil and vanish behind the trees. The explosion briefly illuminated the clearing, revealing a horrific scene of wounded soldiers, blood spattered on the leaves, smoke, and sparks. Realizing the hopelessness of a head-on confrontation, we decided to retreat and regroup. We still had enough men to mount a resistance, but this werewolf, or whatever it was, played by its own rules. It didn't move in formation, wasn't deterred by bullets like normal men, and most chillingly, it struck with precision, appearing suddenly, maiming, then disappearing. Panicked soldiers scattered, firing wildly as they fled in disarray. I tried to shout to signal them to stay together, but panic reigned. Some grabbed their wounded comrades and dragged them toward the river, hoping to take cover behind the boulders along the bank. But the creature herded us, splitting our formation into small, vulnerable groups. That night, our special forces tactics clashed with a beastly instinct that was far more primal. Our training in marksmanship, discipline, and quick thinking proved far less effective than we had hoped. In truth, each of us fought for our own survival, trying to cover one another even as we felt that no coherent plan existed against this mythic monster. Gradually, the cacophony of gunfire and explosions faded as our ammunition ran low and our targets became less distinct. Soon, we realized we had lost more than half our unit. Some fell, felled by enemy bullets or the beast's claws. Others may have simply fled in panic, swallowed up by the forest. It was in the pre-dawn gloom that I, along with a few other soldiers, managed to break away from that nightmare and reach a wide river. A wounded comrade limped behind me, leaving a bloody trail on the ground. Somewhere nearby, that creature still roamed. We couldn't tell if our earlier shots had wounded it or merely enraged it further. Frankly, I could barely feel my legs. Exhaustion, terror, and pain had fused into one overwhelming sensation. It seemed that ahead lay a final crossroads, where we would either perish or attempt the impossible: escape down the raging river. I knew this night was not the end of our nightmare, but perhaps the prelude to its climax. At dawn, we emerged onto a wide river, its torrent roaring somewhere downstream along a rocky slope. I wasn't sure if this was exactly the river marked on our maps, but we had no alternative. Behind us, the sounds of enemy movement, and that same ghastly werewolf growl persisted while our forward path was blocked by steep, rocky gorges. By now, our unit had been whittled down to a critical few. Of those remaining beside me, only 2 were unscathed, while the others barely managed to stand. I tried to convince myself that if we could reach our designated extraction point downstream, we might yet escape. But the river was swollen, its swift current leaving no chance for a quiet crossing. Then suddenly a roar erupted from the right out of the undergrowth, and the silhouette of that very creature materialized in the clearing. It no longer hid among the trees. It had stepped fully into the open. I saw its bloodshot eyes, its teeth curled in a snarl, and a sinister, almost human smirk. It appeared larger than I remembered, as if it had grown in size or strength by feasting on its victims. My remaining comrades raised their weapons. We began firing short, controlled bursts, aiming for its body, its head, any vulnerable spot. The creature howled and lunged to the side, but instead of retreating as before, it sprang directly at us. It felled one soldier with a single blow, and I caught a glimpse of another comrade emptying his magazine in a desperate final burst before the creature's lupine jaws closed around his throat. I realized then that we could not survive a fair fight against such a monster, especially not with our dwindling ammunition and exhausted strength. In a flash of desperate inspiration, I thought, our only hope is to jump into the river as a last resort. If I stayed on the bank, that beast would surely catch me. If not it, then the cartel would. I soon noticed that most of my men lay dead or mortally wounded. I was the only one left standing, my weapon jammed and a searing pain in my shoulder from a previous shrapnel hit. The creature advanced, its guttural growl growing louder, and I had no time to reload my rifle. Dropping my weapon, I snatched a combat knife, fully aware that a knife offered little chance against such a foe, but I had no alternative. At one desperate moment, I stepped forward and swung the knife, hoping, if not to defeat the creature, then at least to delay its assault. It leaped at me, and for a heartbeat, our eyes met. In those eyes, I saw an ancient fury and an inhuman hunger. I felt the impact of a massive paw against my chest. My bulletproof vest had saved me from a direct slash, but the force sent me hurtling several meters away. When I finally managed to rise, reeling with pain and dizziness, the creature was already preparing another lunge. This was the decisive moment. I bolted toward the edge of a cliff, from which the river cascaded in a furious torrent. The beast gave chase, not affording me even a second's advantage. And in that final, fleeting instant, when it nearly loomed over me, I jumped into the void, plunging straight into the raging river. The water was icy. The roar of the current drowned everything around me, a stark contrast to the silent terror of the forest. I choked and struggled desperately to break the surface. The current was relentless. It tossed me about, slamming me against underwater rocks. In a desperate inner monologue, I kept urging myself, "Don't lose consciousness." For a moment, I thought I saw rocky banks above, and on one of them, a dark, unmoving patch that might have been that very creature hesitating at the water's edge. I don't recall how long the river carried me along its tumultuous course. All that remains are fragments of memory. The darkness of the water, the biting, cold, slippery boulders against which I repeatedly collided, and tufts of grass I grasped at in vain. For a moment, I nearly accepted that I would drown, but then I thought of my comrades, the few who might still be hoping for my return. It was that stubborn instinct for survival that propelled me onward. Eventually, the current spat me out onto a sandy shoal near the bank. I collapsed onto dry ground, lying there for several agonizing minutes as I coughed violently, expelling the swampy sludge from my lungs. My arms and legs were numb. Every movement sent waves of pain through me. But I knew that if I didn't get up now, I might be stranded there forever. The forest around me was as ominous as ever. Gathering what little strength I had left, I rose to my knees and scanned my surroundings. There was nothing but the dark silhouettes of trees and the muffled sounds of night intermingled with the distant roar of water. I set off blindly, relying on the battered compass still strapped to my gear. My legs slipped on the damp ground, my clothes were soaked with water and mud, and my wounds bled intermittently. Yet the terror of that lurking creature spurred me on. Days, or maybe just hours, I couldn't tell, passed in a disoriented haze until I finally emerged at the edge of a clearing where I spotted signs of a camp. It was the very mobile forward operating base that we had set up before the operation began. I was soon lifted by patrolling soldiers. Someone brought me water and a medic was summoned. I vaguely heard them asking about the rest of our unit, but I couldn't answer. The horrifying truth was written all over my face. They placed me in a tent, administered painkillers, and once I had regained some semblance of clarity, began questioning me. I recounted everything: the atrocities of the cartel, the ritualistic symbols in the village, the inexplicable monster that had burst from the womb of a pregnant woman, the attacks on my men, and how our unit had been shattered during our retreat. The officers listened grimly. Some scribbled notes, others shook their heads in disbelief, but I could see that they understood. What had happened in those jungles defied logic. A few days later, I was transferred to a military base closer to the border, where a formal debriefing and paperwork were completed. The strangest part was the silence from higher command. Those of us who had survived that hell received no honors or public commendations. Instead, within a couple of weeks, I saw the final report. The case had been sealed as secret and tucked away in the depths of bureaucratic archives. There were no triumphant accounts of victory, no official confirmation of what had truly happened in those jungles. To the outside world, it was all written off as a successful elimination of the drug cartel accompanied by casualties due to combat. But I know the truth isn't that simple. Some dark evil still lingers there deep within the tropical thicket, saturating the land with blood and fear. And although my case has been classified, the memories remain with me. Often I wake in a cold sweat at night, haunted by the echoes of that beast's howl. I live, but that forest and that monster have forever taken up residence within me, repeatedly reminding me how easily the line between reality and the supernatural can be erased by the cruelty of human hands.